You caught some Twitter flack for your comment on Brett Kavanaugh. Care to address your comment and the blowback? Well, I addressed the comment because I wrote a blog post, and so that was probably the right way not only to address it, but that would have been the right way to handle it to begin with. So I'll address it. Sure, I'll address it, and I'll address the blowback as well. Look, just because you have an idea doesn't mean that it's the only idea. And just because you have an idea doesn't mean it's right. And so, like, it's weird for me in some sense to engage in public discourse, especially politically, because you see, I've been a researcher for a very long period of time. And so most of the people that I've talked to about serious ideas, most of them, many of them, have been researchers, graduate students, for example. And when you're talking about a problem, whatever it might be, if you're research oriented, what you do is kind of what you do if you're a therapist, the way I laid out advice for a young therapist earlier. It's like, okay, well, what does everybody think the problem is? And so you assume that you don't know. It's like, okay, well, we have a big discussion about what everybody thinks the problem is. Well, what do you think the real problem is? Like, what's the real problem with the Kavanaugh situation? Well, one might be, well, Kavanaugh was accused of sexual impropriety when he was a high school student. And because of that, his suitability for the Supreme Court is in question. Maybe that's the problem. Yeah, maybe. And maybe that's not the problem. Who the hell knows what the problem is? So here's a bunch of possibilities. We haven't had a reasonable discussion about what constitutes an acceptable statute of limitations with regards to accusations of misbehavior between individuals. It's like, well, can you accuse someone reasonably 5 years later, 10 years later, 15 years later, 40 years later? Like, is there a limit? Do you have a moral obligation, if you're going to accuse someone or even seek justice, to do that within a reasonable period of time? Who knows? We don't. So that's a problem. What exactly are the rules that govern the conduct of men and women when they're young, when they're drinking? Are we going to have that conversation? No, we're not going to have that conversation either, because no one wants to think of that through, and they especially don't want to think it through with regards to the complicating additional feature of alcohol. The thing about alcohol is the reason that people drink is so that they can act stupidly and have fun. Now, the problem with acting stupidly and having fun when you're sober is that it makes you anxious, and so you don't do it. But alcohol, especially for people for whom alcohol is a good drug, ramps up the excitement of impulsivity and quells the anxiety. And so people often drink because they want to go out and be stupid and have fun. And look, I understand that there's something to be said for stupid fun, but one of the things that also needs to be said about it is it's bloody well dangerous. And so we don't want to have that conversation. We don't have that conversation on campuses. We talk about the rape crisis. Nobody talks about the alcohol sexual assault crisis. If men and women didn't drink together, there'd be virtually no sexual assault. And in fact, if people didn't drink at all, there'd be almost no violent crime, because alcohol contributes to violent crime in a manner that you can hardly imagine. But 50% of the people who are murdered are drunk, and about 50% of the people who do the murdering are drunk. And that's probably an underestimate, because the stats aren't kept that well. And it also depends on how you define drunk. So that could also be a problem. Well, the liberals, left types, let's call them the left-leaning progressive types, don't want a conservative on the Supreme Court. The left-leaning types aren't happy that Trump won the election. The conservatives want to rush a candidate onto the Supreme Court come hell or high water because of the November election. Then there's another problem. Well, is this about Kavanaugh at all, or is this about Roe and Wade and about abortion? Well, who knows, right? It's about all those things. So it's an unbelievably complicated, god-awful situation. And so Eric Weinstein and Brett Weinstein were tweeting about this, and it was late at night, and Eric said, as far as I can tell, either way, this is not going to end well. And I thought, oh, he said, is there an alternative? Is there a way out of that? And I thought, oh, that's an interesting question. What might be a way out of that? And I thought, well, Kavanaugh's in a rough position because he can't withdraw, obviously, and perhaps shouldn't, without his reputation being shattered. And if he doesn't get nominated, same thing. His life is basically over. So, but on the other hand, he's tangled up in a scandal that's of sufficient murk and mud so that it isn't self-evident that he can serve as a Supreme Court justice without having every single one of his decisions, especially in contentious cases, produce a tremendous amount of social upheaval over the next 2 or 3 decades. And it isn't obvious that that's a great move forward. Now, it might be fine. I mean, there's been controversy around other Supreme Court justice nominations, and that seems to have basically sorted itself out. And I already said, just because you're thinking something through doesn't mean you're right. It's a simulation. So I thought, well, if I was in Kavanaugh's position and I felt that my candidacy had been compromised, perhaps through no fault of my own, I am not saying anything about his innocence or guilt, but that my candidacy had been compromised by this interminable and ugly scandal, and that meant that my tenure on the Supreme Court might be marked by culturally divisive controversy in the long run, maybe it would be better for me to be nominated, to say, look, it's too murky, it's too muddy, and I don't think the country is best served by my accepting the nomination. Then the Conservatives can nominate another candidate, get their person on the Supreme Court, so there's no necessary loss there, and perhaps we could move forward with a relative minimum of divisiveness. Now, look, in my blog, I laid out all the reasons why that isn't a good idea. Like, here, maybe if you just give me 5 seconds, I can read some of them, because I tried to make a steel man case for why my idea wasn't a good one, my idea about him withdrawing. So just give me 1 second and I'll read all the potential objections just so that you know that I've thought them through. So perhaps the Democrat opposition would mount a similar campaign against my putative successor. Well, that's certainly possible. But I said, well, that would provide virtually unassailable evidence for the purely manipulative and political motivation of the accusers, forcing them to duplicate their strategy a second time. That would help reveal the machinations for what they were in a manner that would be virtually undeniable. Perhaps time is of the essence, and there'd be no way to place another candidate of conservative leaning on the bench before the November elections. As they say, however, act in haste, repent in leisure. Okay, and then other arguments against my position. Here they are. Oh, yes. If Kavanaugh withdrew after being nominated, here's what might happen. It would be read as an admission of guilt on his part. It would embolden those who would use reputation destruction as a political maneuver. It would weaken the generally and vitally important idea of the presumption of innocence. It would indicate weakness on the part of the Republicans at a key moment prior to the November elections. It would mean that an innocent man has been successfully pilloried by a mob. It would validate the use of allegations of past behavior well past any reasonable expiry date as a weapon. It would destroy the Republican opportunity to choose a Supreme Court justice, hand the Democrats an unearned victory, embitter a large percentage of the conservative base who would regard the withdrawal as a betrayal, and last and perhaps least, violate my own personal adage, for what that's worth, of don't apologize if you haven't done anything wrong. Okay, so I understand the weaknesses of that position. I was putting it forward as a potential third alternative. Now, look, it's perfectly reasonable to put things forward as alternatives. That's thinking. Now, having said that, I made some mistakes. Okay, so the first mistake was don't tweet complicated ideas in 140 characters about contentious issues in the midst of a controversy at 2 a.m, right? Bad idea. And so one of the consequences of this for me is that I've withdrawn quite a lot over the last 3 weeks from Twitter. Twitter's a very dangerous platform, and so I'm taking a break from it while I'm reevaluating its utility. And so because I talked to my son about this before and other members of my family, and we had agreed that I wasn't going to post anything on Twitter that should be made into a blog. But the problem with Twitter is that it or the problem with me, who knows where the problem is that Twitter invites and facilitates impulsive responding. And so I'm not convinced that it's necessarily a good platform for me. Of all the places that I tend to get into trouble, Twitter is sort of at the top of the list. Now, I laid out in my blog why I still use it. I feel some moral obligation to the almost 1 million people who follow me on Twitter, for example. And there's an addictive quality to it too. I'm following a lot of these people in the intellectual dark web and seeing what they're up to and trying to keep an eye on the cultural climate, let's say. And it's not easy to figure out, for me, as it sure is the case for all of you, exactly how much you should be exposed to such things and how much you should protect yourself. I mean, a case could certainly be made that I should stay the hell off Twitter and do nothing but write for the next year, because it's not like I have any shortage of things to write about. So I'm trying to sort that out. So that's my explanation. And it could easily be that, as I said, it could easily be that the idea that I put forward wasn't the best idea. Who knows what the best idea is? Maybe the best idea was for Kavanaugh to do exactly what he did. Who knows? So, and more, good luck to him and to the Supreme Court. I hope it all stabilizes. That would be lovely. And it has happened before, and so maybe it will again. So